Sometimes a different perspective is pretty important. As an avid World of Warcraft player for far too many years, the job balance drama that's going on around P8S has felt a little bit like I'm peering into the goddamn Twilight Zone. After seeing nothing, basically my entire time playing FF since, recently playing again, I've seen nothing but comparisons between Warcraft logs and FF logs, right? The graphs there. Hearing praise for jobs being unique and homogenous, just homogenous enough that composition rarely matters. But generally, right, the opinion of all these comparisons is the team is on point most of the time. And it feels like complete whiplash to have players suddenly up in arms and kind of explode over it all, this ticking time bomb of sorts. And the worst part is, they're right, they're completely right. Job balance has extremely obvious problems as soon as you start to look at the data, and then you gotta think, how did it get that way? So today I think I'm here, I want to get to the bottom of it. We should try. And if you're watching from the
"Stop nitpicking, you sweaty losers"
camp, there is a nugget of truth to be found in that too. That's something I sort of agree with at times. And it's something I really want to talk about because there are hard facts of reality for players and the community and developers as well to deal with. And I want to provide the perspective of both a World of Warcraft player and as someone who spends a hell of a lot of time thinking about the difference between a perfect game and a fun one. Let's get my complete lack of gamer credentials out of the way first so you know where I'm coming from. I haven't rated Savage beyond P1S and Party Finder. I haven't done the Ultimates. I parse reasonably well in the extremes as Ninja and Sage. And I only ever had one proper stint of Mythic rating in World of Warcraft. That was in Legion. And it went pretty well. Last kill just before the servers went down. But it was too time intensive as someone who plays different games. So basically the point is, my perspective is that of an observer, specifically an outside observer. Right, job balance. What's the actual issue? People have been up in arms and exploding over effectively not feeling able to play whatever they want when they're pushing the hardest tier of content in their first few weeks. And to some players of other games, that's going to sound insane, but that shows how good it's been so far. And this is genuinely bad. The damage requirement in P8S's door boss for week 1 was so high that bringing lower performing jobs, very specifically most of the problems around Machinist, because it sits the lowest on the totem pole overall, that's causing issues. If you played perfectly and had more crits than usual, you might have cleared it. But the next time, bad crit RNG could mean a wipe. And I don't think I need to say this, but wiping to a DPS check purely because of bad RNG or even just bad balance is understandably an extremely miserable game experience. Then, of course, Yoshi P responded with a great quote, as always. But unfortunately, this time he didn't say what people actually wanted to hear. The first response was a more or less a 1% nerf to the boss health, and he basically said, "Our team were better than usual. Sorry, so we accidentally made it too hard," which came across like a flex. And that was true, but not the root of the problem. So people were pissed off. They kind of got this whole vibe of, "Are you saying we're wrong?" It seemed like a flex. But it was mostly, honestly, because Paladin and Warrior got some buffs that were necessary at the same time. But Machinist, the actual problem, the root problem, Machinist's balance, sounds nothing. And the problem, people saw it, the boss wasn't too hard. Machinist is too weak. That's it. That was the problem. And the real issue then for players is that manifests in Party Finder, right? Machinist players are kicked. The DPS slots are locked out of Machine. Stuff like that happens, and that is genuinely awful. Anyone who geared for Machinist felt forced to either re-gear for a different job or to go Dancer or Bard. And this is the important part, even if they didn't want to. And that's, outside of some interstatic stuff, that's basically new to FF14, at least in people's recent perspective of it. Obviously, it's had problems in the past. So this is a major player experience problem then. Yoshi P, of course, then realized he did a whoopsie and quickly expanded on what he said in what I think is an exceptional amount of detail, but he also held his ground, which annoyed some people. Effectively, he said that they balance individual fights around the current job balance and they avoid changing jobs. Because, it's like you change content, jobs stay the same, you change jobs, every bit of content balance changes. And on the raid tester stuff, they weren't actually flexing. He clarified to say that they usually add a few percent after testing because the players are way better than the raid test team. But this time, the testing team actually grinded the fight way longer and way harder than usual to make sure it worked. And they still add the same amount of percentage instead of going, "Oh, they'd perform better this time, we'll bring it down a little bit. We'll add less this time." And he's right. His logic is completely sound there. That all makes sense. If they change how Machinist performs, then they change it in all content. If they pull P8S down to where they wanted it to be, nothing else gets touched. That makes sense. But just because the logic presented for a decision is right, it doesn't mean that it feels good. Or, and this is the key part to this whole discussion, just because the logic's right there doesn't mean it's right for everything, for the whole view, for the entire game. Like this whole thing, if the fight was how they intended, this wouldn't have been a problem. No one would have had an issue. Machinist would have went ahead and be like, oh yeah, we cleared the fight, that's fine, okay. But the problem was that Machinist was always this way, right? This has always been a problem. It's just been a minor problem. Now it's actually manifesting in a bad experience for players. It's like outward and causing people to have, like, I guess like emotional reactions and speak like online about it. And that's the part where now it's time to actually look into this. And by look into it, I mean solve it, right? Quick little pass Machinist, bring some potencies up. Easy, fixed, does damage. But no, they haven't done that, so clearly they're not going to. So why would they? We should probably take a look at Machinist from the developer's perspective. The way I see it, and I think they do, Machinist is inherently a struggle to bounce. I myself can only confess to playing it like the mid-50s or so, but even then it's like immediate what the issue is, right? Physical range is this great experience, you move freely, you drop your grip mitigation, your tactician, shield slam, whatever, when necessary, you kind of just get to vibe. No other job outside of like Summoner mostly can get to do that. Just kind of free flow and do whatever you feel like. But there are 3 specific points for Machinist where this kind of goes wrong. 1, it's crazily dependent on latency and pretty high APM, second only to Ninja. The interplay with Hypercharge and Wildfire, especially with the Heat Blast reset of Gauss and Ricochet, it means you have these periods of weaving, right? You're weaving at 1.5 second GCD, which is fast as hell. And if you're high ping, you might start clipping despite even just single weaving. There's a reason a particularly third-party tool is popular among Machinist mains, especially those from the likes of Australia and stuff. It makes the job work as intended. And on APM, actually, they average out, like I was saying, to just below Ninja as per this graph that someone compiled from P7S. But it's a lot more concentrated into a small window. You've got that 1.5 second GCD for, is it six GCDs you fit in there, which includes so it's like 12, 13 button presses in a very short period of time. And that's like, it's more intense than Ninja. Ninja has a finger spaghetti burst, but it lasts longer. Machinist has got this kind of big moment that's really susceptible to interruptions, susceptible to, I guess, player error, susceptible to ping, stuff like that. And that's where things start to go wrong. It's all a higher margin for error. And that's something that, based on the ping stuff, Square Enix might not actually understand that entirely because of their historical response to people who complain about ping for weaving and for Machinist. Their testing staff, right, and the Japanese player base, they never have to worry about ping. In Japan, you're probably looking at like 12 to 20 at most. And then obviously if you're playing on the server, you've got 0 ping or 1 or 2 ping, stuff like that. So the margin of error should give you more damage, right? As it does for Ninja and Black Mage, because those are hard. Those are harder, they've got higher APM, they've got more like punishing stuff as in part of it, because you mess up Tenchi Gen, that's a bunch of your stuff because you're forced to move. Things like that, Black Mage, out of ley lines, sorry, your damage is gone. And those exist for Ninja and Black Mage, right? Those are clearly there. Clearly, this is hard, so you get to do more damage when you play properly. That's why they're always on top of the DPS for their group usually. But for Machinist, that clearly upon all the stats we have all the stats we can look at, that is just not true. Compare, say, Machinist to Dancer. Dancer's a hell of a lot easier, but it does an awful lot more damage, so clearly something isn't right there. The second thing then is the range tax. This one's obvious. Physical ranged has to pay a tax because you can move whenever you want, whatever you want. You don't have to worry about positionals. You can stand in Narnia. You can stand right under the tank's chin. Well, that wouldn't end well, but you could do whatever you want. Melee and casters aren't greater risks because casters have to stand still. Melee have to deal with positionals, stay in close. There's that greed, the downtime, stuff like that. That'll especially manifest in Savage, right? Especially early, because the people who are logging and parsing, they'll be the most skilled melee and casters in the game. They'll be playing closer to perfectly. So the stats won't represent the full picture. The amount of players who are kind of shitty and being punished for that. So the stats aren't really accurate. And then there's the other thing where people have been talking about how large hitboxes have been recently. Missing positionals, getting downtime. They've been less of an issue recently, which means range tax isn't as necessary seeming. It's less necessary. It's just, why are we paying this tax if we're not getting any of the benefits from it anymore? That's what people are feeling like when they're playing those jobs. And that makes sense for right this second. It's a sound enough argument, but the thing to actually remember is that people take the path of least resistance. If the ranged tax was removed and a Machinist, Dancer, Bard did as much damage as melee, then the complete freedom to position would make them the best choice by far. And there's a world where that could enable some real degenerate shit for positioning, and ultimately keeping potential melee downtime in the raid toolkit is fairly important. The range tax deserves to exist, but like in real life, taxes have to actually pay for something to make sense.
But Matt, you say, the range tax, it applies to Bard, it applies to Dancer. But they aren't this bad. What gives? Why is Machinist the red-headed stepchild?
The third thing, raid buffs. That makes this all very hard to balance. And I'll tell you why. In Savage, you're more likely to have players who know what they're doing. So that means raid buffs will overlap maximally. They'll all be done on the right GCD for that comp. Players will have optimized every single GCD and weave window within those windows, which means a raid buff is massively more powerful than they are in other contexts. So, raid buff will maybe do X damage in normal because of how people are playing. It'll do like 2x or 3x or 4x or even more in Savage because people know what they're doing. So job balance has to take into account the lower end of the window in normal, but also in Savage, the higher end of the window. And that's going to be everything there. And that means Bards and Dancers are boosted way beyond Machinist. As you see here in this graph, on these graphs, it flips on normal. Machinist goes from the worst ranged in Savage overall to the best ranged. Now there are things like parse frequency, better players playing better jobs, and gear that can stop this data from being fully conclusive, but if you're following, the logic tracks. You can even see the gap between Summoner and Black Mage here. It grows, right? Savage Black Mages average out better, and like we discussed, risk reward, they're rewarded for it. And I could get into utility here, because utility is important as part of it, but I'd played Druid and Paladin in World of Warcraft, so I'd be here for the next 45 minutes, mostly crying. Meanwhile, FF seems to have a good grasp on that. Except, of course, you may notice a trend for Machinist. In almost every way, as far as job balance is concerned, it's an outlier. All of this points to the conclusion that balancing for a variety of compositions and players is actually really bloody hard, and unfortunately, it always manifests in the most extreme levels, right? It'll manifest at the extreme levels of low, but no one cares about that. So it'll be the top end of play. Everything does. And that's why this should be taken with a pretty big grain of salt. The easy fix is that Machinist really needs something like a raid buff to match Bard or Dancer and boost their RDPS. It boosts the high end of damage in Savage without making them too much stronger solo, but it's also not something you can just add, right? You can't just go, raid buff, here you go. It requires a bit of a rework and to make a whole new set of spell effects and think about the whole job's design and, how does it work? Is it going to make them too strong? Is it going to make all these other jobs too strong, etc., etc., etc.? They could probably also do with some utility. But these changes do something that we're getting very dangerously close to as far as the game's concerned, more homogenization. And that is, honestly, a really, really bad thing. Given the game's recent history, even like a Machinist rework might just do that. Here's the danger, right? Machinist is old as shit, and you can clearly tell. It is the red-headed stepchild. It's got problems going back to its inception, constantly little tweaks and shit that kind of makes it worse and better, hard to know. It's a selfish DPS, and it gets nothing cool for being in the bottom of the totem pole. It's over there, in the corner, selfish, and it's not even getting anything from it. So clearly a rework is needed before too long, but I will tell you this, given how things are going. As someone who praised the class changes that came to World of Warcraft in Legion at the time, I wish we had all collectively looked at the future with the dread we should have instead of hope. The level of core gameplay homogenization that has taken, over 6 years? 3 expansions to start fixing? Even in FF, right? The 2-minute cooldown changes of the last while have now been noticed as a problem. And that stuff was praised at the time because by the logic presented it was sound. But it was the second and third order effects that weren't entirely measured. I was like, 2 minutes, it makes sense, stops outliers, sweet, grand. But now we're noticing it's starting to get boring. It's starting to get rigid, and it's presenting balance problems of its own, because everything's on this one straight and narrow 2-minute line. Balance being so close to homogeneous, the high end, means that we're reduced to complaining about things like crit RNG. Like, now we're getting guaranteed crits in Madari. Like, what's next? Crit being removed entirely? And a lot of you probably think that makes sense. Of course it makes sense. You've got, less variance, you can balance better. And you're right, it's cleaner, it's smoother. But doesn't the idea give you the heebie-jeebies? This is all hypothetical, but where's the line? Does everyone get the same utility? Does everyone get the same damage? Well, if that's the case, then everyone has to play the same. At the top of this video, I said something about video games being fun instead of perfect. And that's something we should really keep in mind, because perfect balance almost always comes at the expense of shit being just not interesting. Most games, like esports games and modern games and stuff, they'll employ cyclical balance. They'll change the meta because they know that when something's balanced, everyone goes, "This is boring now, I'm not playing this." They like things to change up and be like, interesting, right? People would rather have a game that's crazy within reason than one that's squeaky clean but doesn't have any character. And that's the thing where maybe the answer shouldn't be more homogenization. Maybe the answer should be more depth, a higher skill ceiling. Maybe the whole thing should be, alright, Savage Raiders, you think you're hot shit? Try this out for size. That might even, like in terms of class design, that might actually be the plan here, to make that variance matter more instead of just 2-minute cooldowns, everyone. Everyone gets a raid buff. Oh, we can't give you crit as a raid buff because that increases variance. Everyone gets a mug. Everyone in the game now has mug. There you go. That's perfectly balanced. But, I mean, isn't there an episode of Fairly Odd Parents that kind of shows what a perfectly balanced world would look like? And the answer, and I know that's a bit of a weird reference, it's not anime per usual, but that's what it is, right? You don't want everyone to be the same. You want things to be different. And sometimes things being different and balanced is really hard to do, which means you can't make changes on a hair trigger. That's one of the important parts. You can't make changes on a hair trigger. You can't just go, I will just tweak the knob so it's the same amount of damage, sorted, because something will have to give there. Having said all that, bad player experiences are bad player experiences, and Machinist 100% needs fixed before too long. Ideally, like maybe some potency in 6.25, but ideally like a raid buff in 6.3 and then a rework to give them some damage parity, some unique utility. I would just caution against letting Week 1 Savage Raiders dominate the discourse, because that did not bode well for World of Warcraft. Took a while, but that was... oh boy, that certainly happened. But one thing I've noticed watching communities develop solutions is this, right? Players are extremely good at identifying problems. They're game players, especially good ones, of course they are. They're also extremely good at identifying potential solutions to those problems. Again, of course, that's what they're trained to do. They're problem solvers. They appear to be like better than most developers at this sometimes, because players have like a different perspective, right? They're closer to their own experience too. So they get like into the weeds, whereas developers they kind of have to take this like outside look, but players are in there going, we'll wrestle with the problem. But the one thing I've noticed is they're also extremely bad at seeing the second and third order effects, seeing what this solution to this problem will do to the rest of the game. I go into examples that I have from my time in World of Warcraft, but I'd be here until 6.3 releases. And that's right, like that's the hardest part of being a developer for big and complex games. You have to ensure that tightening one nut over here, just tick, doesn't make another part of the machine just fucking explode. Like some issues in Week 1 Savage and the World First Race, genuinely unfortunate. They genuinely suck and they should be fixed. They shouldn't happen. But in most cases, fixing it immediately is not worth the damage it's probably going to do to the rest of the game. And this is a little bit dire, but consider this a warning from someone who watches entire classes die in another game for, no joke, years at a time. I saw you, Redditor, who said Machinist is just becoming Shaman. The fact that one job is excluded for a few weeks of a tier and almost all of the mains can swap to another job with most of the same gear on the same character, Jesus, what a blessing. I mean... right, so I have devolved into whataboutism, definitely. But you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Keep that in mind when this stuff's happening. I would say, give decent feedback. I saw the person who translated a bunch of feedback to the Japanese forums, and hopefully that works because, as we're all aware, one of the major problems is Yoshi P and co. I mean, they read Japanese, right? All of that team are going to be able to go and read Japanese. It's not going to be as easy for them to, get that in English and run through translators and try to understand mathematical stuff and like mistranslations of FF terms and stuff like that. But this whole thing of, hey, the Japanese don't really like Machinist because they don't like guns. I mean, this is so stereotypical, but they don't like guns as much as Americans do. So they don't really like pay attention to it. They don't fix it. They kind of leave it, go, well, we don't have to worry about that because it's just the American job. It's just the thing that, we'll make sure Samurai is perfect, Kaiten aside, we'll make sure Ninja's perfect and good. Dragoon gets all the love, it's going to get a rework soon, stuff like that. But Machinist is like, hopefully the noise has been kicked up is actually going to be heard. But it's, oh boy. Yeah, that's basically it. My warning here is this drama could set a dangerous precedent. It really could, in terms of where the focus is and how quick responses need to be, especially for the short term versus long term. But as someone who's watched an awful lot of games go completely down the drain because, I guess because players were getting really getting not angry, but they're getting quick to go, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong, no, that's wrong, and continually get these like just all these solutions offered up, just spewing feedback all over the developers, and them kind of acting too quickly. It is genuinely worrying seeing some of the things that, you recognize from other games actually start to appear because of, maybe it's because of extra popularity, maybe it's just stuff like has happened, we haven't kind of seen it before, but whatever way it goes, there's all the reasons I think that Machinist is definitely needs a solution, but that there's a time and place, or not a time and place, rather there's an order to this stuff, and Yoshi P's logic was sound for now. It's kind of down to them to go, we'll fix this later, and then actually do it. But it is not a hard thing to do, and you don't want them to do the quickest thing, because solving the balance problem makes the game worse. Probably. It's that thing, right, where, this is going to be a weird example, but I don't know how people generally feel about the paranormal, but it's almost like if someone brings a Ouija board to a party, you don't need to kind of believe in the supernatural or know what it's going to do to know that you don't mess with that. It's not worth invoking that. And that's a little bit with how I feel when it comes to taking a minute percentage of the players, an extreme minority that's extremely vocal, and God bless them, they are sometimes the most important players. They're all great and nothing against them or anything they do, but it's that case of you don't want to give them the reins because changes made for them quickly may have impacts on the rest of the game, and we don't want that precedent to be set. Anyway, that'll do me for today. I hope that was kind of enlightening. I hope I grasped everything about Machinist and kind of broader, because I wanted to make sure people kind of understood the depth of this and why they're not just going, here's 500 extra potency across, like a minute. There you go. That job done. Problem solved. Why it actually will take time and kind of just poke them and go, here, solve this. But yes, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again very, very soon.